Hello, good evening. I believe I'm finally live. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director, Defending Rights and Dissent, and I'm in London right now because I'm covering the perhaps final appeal of Julian Assange for Jacobin. Sorry, this was rescheduled from earlier. Some things came up. The situation is very much in flux in London, and I hope this looks okay. I tested the web camera on the laptop I was using for this trip before flying over here, and it worked just fine. And yet here I am on my phone doing this. So thank you very much for joining in tonight. I'm going to be very brief. So this is potentially the final appeal of Julian Assange. In 2021, a barrister or a district judge in the United Kingdom rejected the U.S.'s request to extradite Assange. So how this process works is it's British prosecutors arguing in court, but they're arguing on behalf of U.S. prosecutors. So the British prosecutors, on behalf of the U.S., sought an appeal. A district judge rejected the appeal. In rejecting the appeal, she denied all of the press freedom and political arguments Assange's legal team made against his extradition, the arguments that if you're tuning into this program, you're probably most familiar and concerned with, but denied it on the grounds that his mental health and the likely prison conditions would make his extradition oppressive. So it's a very strange ruling because it upheld the worst press freedom aspects of what the U.S. was trying to do while blocking Assange's extradition. So then what happened was the judge's decision was appealed by the U.S. prosecutors. Again, I'm sorry, the UK prosecutors. It's very confusing. Again, representing the U.S. That part of the decision was thrown out. Also in UK court, you don't have an automatic appeal right. You have to ask for an appeal by making arguments that you have appealable grounds. So after the judge's decision on prison and mental health grounds was rejected, Assange was denied further appeal options at one point in the proceeding, and the Home Secretary, I guess at that point, had signed or certified the extradition, which then allowed the defense for Julian Assange to go back and appeal those parts of the original judge's ruling that were adverse to Julian Assange. So the big point of law in the court today is whether or not the UK can extradite someone to the US for a political offense, and whether or not Assange's alleged crimes constitute a political offense within the meaning of the extradition treaty. There were also some other arguments around how asking for an extradition of a political offense is inherently an abuse of power, as well as arguments about the applicability of the European human rights law on the proceeding. So for people who aren't familiar with this, and I doubt many people are, traditionally extradition treaties prohibit extraditing someone for what's called a political offense. If you get out a law textbook on this, like the one I had when I was in law school, it will tell you there's pure, which is the phrase the defense used, pure political offenses, or absolute political offenses, and sort of relative political offenses. Absolute political offenses are those offenses which are by their nature always political and therefore always barred. Relative political offenses is an offense that isn't inherently political, but in the case is. The absolute political offenses in most textbooks, including the one I had in law school, are treason, sedition, and espionage. Now, obviously, Julian Assange is charged with 17 counts under the Espionage Act. You know, he's not really charged with espionage, but he's charged under the Espionage Act, and therefore that would render the extradition seemingly impermissible under the terms of the extradition treaty. All of the UK's extradition treaties, but I think two, have an exception for political offenses. This was a huge point of diplomatic back and forth between the US and the UK when US courts would refuse to extradite alleged IRA members to Britain. It became so bad there was pressure from Margaret Thatcher, on the Reagan administration to try to amend the extradition treaty. A senator from Delaware, Senator Joe Biden, took great umbrage to this and defended the political offenses exception as being very important. But then in 2003, so the US-UK extradition treaty does bar political offenses. So what's the question of law here? In 2003, the Parliament passed an extradition law that was silent on the issue of political offenses, and the judge in the district case has somehow argued that either removed that exception or that overrides the treaty, or a bunch of other sort of arguments along that line. So the question is whether or not the extradition treaty that stands between the US and the UK, is it something that can still be sought in court? And that was the big legal argument. There were other legal arguments that were made. We're in a hearing about whether or not they'll have a right to appeal. So they're all quite technical. There was a really interesting discussion on the rights of whistleblowers as granted by the European Court of Human Rights. There was some discussion of the CIA plot to assassinate and kidnap Julian Assange. There's a CNN segment that has gone viral. That is CNN apparently learning about this for the first time, even though Yahoo News published it some time ago, and they sort of treat it as a claim of his defense and not this thing that was the subject of a major expose. And then there was also a lot of discussion about whether or not it was foreseeable that somebody could think that by doing what Julian Assange did, they'd be indicted under the Espionage Act. And here the defense pointed out that this is an unprecedented prosecution. There are lots of leaks. There are lots of prosecutions of whistleblowers or leakers, but no one has ever prosecuted the publisher or the journalist before. So it was unforeseeable. So that was sort of where we are at with the legal arguments. The defense for Assange went today. The British prosecutors on behalf of the US will go tomorrow. The judges were mostly quiet. There were some questions that kept harkening back on this claim that Assange had revealed human sources. Of course, that's quite a controversial claim because WikiLeaks was involved in redacting certain human sources from the State Department cables, but they were leaked to the internet in a convoluted process I'm not going to go into tonight against WikiLeaks' will. Stefania Morici has written a lot about this. I highly recommend reading her book on WikiLeaks. She talks about this. And that's sort of where we're at. The judges kept bringing that up. But beyond that, they were fairly quiet for most of the day. A couple of other observations I'm going to make, and then I am going to get off because I have been up doing this since 7 o'clock in the morning, and it is now 10 o'clock here in London. Apologize if I sound slightly delirious. There was a huge protest outside the court today. When I arrived at 8:30, I got there 2 hours early because I wasn't sure. I mean, I had press credentials, but I didn't really trust the court. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I got there very early, and there was at least 1,000, maybe thousands of people all outside the courthouse. And I was really impressed that this number of people showed up, 2 hours before the hearing. When I left the hearing at 4:30 and walked outside, there were still hundreds of people protesting outside. I believe there was a rally with a microphone that went on throughout the day. I spoke in the morning. I hear people spoke during the lunch break. And then I know people spoke at the end and gave updates on what had happened. So it's really heartening to see this very large crowd come out all day for Julian Assange. I heard that people have traveled from Italy or Switzerland to do this. Then the next thing I'll talk about has been the incredible difficulties faced by journalists like myself in just covering this trial. As people may have heard, all international press who would not be present in England and Wales, so that's the point of being in international press, you're not in the country where the thing is happening, were denied remote access to the hearing, saying it wasn't in the interest of justice to do so. I had this remote access denied. Fox News had this happen. Truth Out had this happen. Stefania Morici had this happen. Kevin Costola had this happen. Literally, as far as anyone knows, that every single international journalist had their remote access denied, unless they said they were going to be in London for the hearing. A lot of people like myself applied for both. In the event that I couldn't make it to London, I wanted to have remote access. Or I guess the vice versa was, if I didn't have remote access, I'd have to come to London. The other aspect of this is they waited super long to grant any in-person credentials, or to deny the remote access. So the hearing started on a Tuesday. It's Tuesday today. And the decisions were all made on Friday. So on Friday morning DC time, late afternoon Washington or London time, I got an email denying me my remote access. My flight was on Sunday, and it was completely silent on whether or not I would have in-person access. I tried to call the courthouse. The courthouse was closed. Then at 1:00 Washington time, 6:00 London time, so after the court is closed, I get this email telling me I will be in Court 3 Annex for the hearing. So okay, I'm off to London then. But I mean, it is really very stressful to be doing international travel and not knowing, one business day before if you'll even have access to the court, because it's very hard to get in, because there are, hundreds, thousands of people who are here interested in this case without that remote access. And Stefania Morici has talked about the fact that, she got her email granting her credentials on Monday while she was boarding her flight. I mean, she was boarding her flight to come here in hope she would get credentials. Had I not heard a decision about credentials on Friday, I would have had to cancel my Sunday flight, which I almost did because the courthouse was closed. So they waited to the last minute to grant anyone credentials, to make international travel very difficult. They've denied remote access. And just to give some background, I covered the previous two appeal hearings in the long-running Assange v. Government of the United States extradition case for Jacobin. Both times I was granted remote access without any sort of problems. So this is a new policy in this case. And then once we got to the courtroom, I was one of those journalists who was assigned to the overflow room. They just sort of assigned up front whether you could be in the actual court or in the overflow room. A lot of journalists prefer the overflow room because there's tables and desks, and you can actually do work. So the way the overflow room works was it's like the regular court, and there's the lower well where the desks are that the journalists want to use. And then there's this section called the gallery, which is this balcony with basically like church pews that are very uncomfortable, no tables. And they actually sit higher than the 4 chandeliers. There's 4 chandeliers, and it sits higher. And us journalists in the annex wanted to sit at the desk, wanted to sit at the tables. And we were told that by order of the judge, no journalists were allowed in this part of the court. And my understanding is that in other cases, this is where the journalists usually are. Members of the public could sit at the desk and work, but journalists could not. I don't begrudge members of the public. But, at one point I came in and sat down, and a man came up and asked to see my seat permission and saw that I was pressed and was like, you're not supposed to be here, and threw me out to the balconies. And like I said, there's 2 TVs. They'd be a nice sized television in your house, probably too big for your house. But from a balcony, like a distance away above 4 chandeliers, it's barely visible. And the only sound is the sound on the monitor on the television. There's no speakers up in the gallery area. And for the first 15 minutes, the audio quality was so bad, they had to stop the proceeding and work on it. But throughout, the journalist in the annex where I was had incredible problems with audio, incredible problems seeing it. I believe there was audio problems on the live stream, or not live stream, or in the remote access generally. They allowed people to access it without turning off their cameras. So, Assange's attorneys would be talking, and randomly some guy's face with his iPhone horizontal, not vertical. And I was very careful to put mine on horizontal before doing this, just popped up. There was a sound of flushing water. I'm not even going to hypothesize on what that was. I think we all know what it was that drowned out one of the attorneys. So you have people flushing their toilet and popping up in the middle of a court proceeding, and this is in the room, the overflow room for the journalist. I guess they just played the same remote access that the journalists in England and Wales got access to. Anyone who's ever done a Zoom conference call knows you mute everyone or you don't let them even be visible. Why, for one of the most important press freedom cases in the history of the world, would you? Oh, balloons are going up. Why would you let them, disrupt the proceedings like that for those watching remotely and those in the overflow room? I don't know. And again, after lunch, the court came and told us that the judge stuck by their decision that the journalist had to stay in this weird Gothic balcony. And the person who informed us of this had no role in the decision. So, I didn't bully her or anything like that, but I asked her very politely, did you tell the judge the journalist can't see? Yes. Did you tell the judge the journalist can't hear? Yes. Did you tell the judge the journalist can't work? Yes. And the judge stuck to this decision, and it caused incredible outrage and frustration amongst the journalists who were in the Court 3 Annex. There were some very tense moments. So that is, I think, a big scandal. I know Reporters Without Borders had a op-ed in The Guardian a few days ago where they commented in terms of NGO and media access. This has been the worst. This has been the worst that is of any of the trials they've covered. And, they cover trials in countries we're told are authoritarian. So there is a real, question, is this malice or incompetence? And I tend to not want to assume malice where there is incompetence. The court is clearly not ready for the hundreds to thousands of people who came for this, people who had other cases, had difficulty getting into the long queue, the cafeteria ran out of food during lunchtime. But every journalist and NGO and expert I've spoken to throughout this incredibly bonkers process, from the fact of waiting until the Friday before the Tuesday to tell people if they had remote access or if they should travel down to the weird balcony we were put in. And I know I sound petty talking about the balcony, but if you were there, you would understand precisely what had happened here. Everyone feels like this is an attack on press coverage of this proceeding, and that here we have the press freedom trial of the 21st century, and there is a real effort to make it as difficult as humanly possible for journalists to cover it. And it's really, in my opinion, and I guess my opinion doesn't count for very much, it's extremely bad form when people are accusing you of putting journalism itself on trial to then, put up these dumb, petty obstacles like not allowing journalists to have tables that are clearly for the journalist, making them sit in a balcony where they can't see anything, to do that. It just sort of reinforces the image that you're here to kill press freedom, which is, not an image I think I'd want to reinforce if I was the British courts. So again, it is really a scandal the way the international media is being treated who wants to cover this. That being said, there are many journalists there besides myself. There are many courageous people who have come, parliamentarians. There were a huge number of people outside both before and after the hearing. I'm extremely heartened and inspired by this. And, everywhere I've gone in London, when I've mentioned I'm here to cover this hearing, people have expressed disgust at the way in which Julian Assange has been persecuted and treated and destroyed. So there is a groundswell of anger and opposition to what the UK and the US are doing here. And I guess something I should have mentioned to begin with, the big question was whether or not Julian Assange himself would appear in court today. I think that was one of the reasons why we thought they were restricting remote access, because they want to prosecute people if they take a screenshot or take a picture inside the court. That's why I didn't take a picture of the deranged balcony I was on, because I realized I cannot quite do justice to where I was sitting. But they wanted to put them in jail for doing that. And a lot of the assumption was that Julian Assange would be there. He would look quite frail. Julian Assange was allowed to appear in court, either in person or remotely, but he did not due to illness. He opted not to appear, which just, again, stresses how difficult this process has been for him. And a lot of people have rightly been focusing on sort of Navalny and his death in custody in the Russian state. And while we don't know the causes of his death, many people are taking the position that, the Russian state is responsible for persecuting him either way. And I think that's a legitimate position to take. But when you look at how sick Julian Assange is, you look at the fact that he could die in custody. Are people who take that position willing to apply it to the Assange case? And I'm willing to apply it to both. If Julian Assange dies in custody, this is a murder, right? Whether or not it's through natural causes or not, because he has been made sick, he has been made ill by these conditions of confinement, by this ridiculous persecution that will not end. And I'm willing to put the blame on Biden and Trump. So I don't think I have anything else to say. Thank you so much for joining. As you can see, I'm in my hotel room. It's been an extremely long day, and I have to get up again tomorrow and do it again. Not that I'm ungrateful about that. I'm extremely happy that I had the chance to make this trip possible. And if people enjoy the reporting that I'm doing and the work that Defending Rights in Dissent is doing, I mean, this has been a very expensive a trip, for obvious reasons. I would invite you to go to rightsinDissent.org. Click that. I hate asking people for money, but I'm going to do it in this case. Click that donate button and give whatever you can, so Defending Rights in Dissent can have people on the ground in London. We've had people on the ground in Washington, D.C. We've been on this case since before the Chelsea Manning court-martial, warning about the consequences of persecuting WikiLeaks under the Espionage Act. And now we're here and we're still fighting this. So if you want us to keep doing this work, please, 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 please go to rightsinDissent.org and hit the donate button. And most of our donations are small individual contributions. They go a long way when they're put together collectively. So please do that. Thank you very much. Good night and good luck.